Welcome to Cyber Focus from the McCrary Institute, where we explore the people and ideas shaping and defending our digital world. I'm your host, Frank Cilluffo, and today we're taking a little bit of a different track to this particular episode. We are releasing a major effort in terms of priorities for the incoming administration on cybersecurity. I have one of my co-chairs and co-authors and another co-author joining me today, Mark Montgomery, who is also leading the Cyber Solarium 2.0 Commission, and George Barnes, who just recently left as Deputy Director of NSA, is at Red Cell and also a Senior Fellow at the McCrary Institute. The transition report is a culmination of multiple meetings comprised of our senior fellows and other subject matter experts from our law enforcement community, our intelligence community, our military community, as well as obviously our private sector owners and operators. Quite honestly, the amount of expertise in that room, I think, added so much to what we hope is a robust report that doesn't sit on a shelf and rather is translated from those nouns into verbs. Irrespective of who wins the presidency in November, cybersecurity is going to be a priority and must be elevated. And this is a very nonpartisan effort, spanned 5 different administrations, including the women and men who had leadership roles for 5 different presidents on cybersecurity. So a little bit of a different take, but thought we'd start it by, why did we put this together, Mark?
Well, I think you came up with the idea, and the idea was that last time the Solarium Commission did, as part of the actual commission, did a white paper to turn over ideas to an incoming administration. With no commission, the commission sunsetted, no one there. I think you had the good idea that, hey, we kind of owe this to the next commission, because one of the things we've determined is that after 16, 18 years of struggling in the wilderness to get cyber and critical infrastructure protection up at the right level, it's fair to say the last 4 years have seen a lot of action. Mm-hmm. Part of it is the result of the commission, which you were a commissioner on and which I was the executive director of. But a lot of it has to do with the current administration has really tackled this. Didn't hurt that SolarWinds arrived at the same time as the administration. But in any case, the most important thing in Washington is momentum. And to have momentum, you have to have ideas. To have ideas, you have to have papers like the one that you led us through here. So from my perspective, this exists to help the next administration maintain the momentum that we've seen created over the last 4 years.
And George, before I pull you in, I think it's worth noting that the composition of the task force members spans 5 administrations with cyber leaders, which is pretty much the beginning of what we were at least referring to as cyber from the Clinton administration all the way through to the current administration. And if I can just add that we really did break it out into 8 lines of effort, which we'll get into. But ultimately, what I think we were trying to do is recognize, and I think, Mark, you said it very well, momentum matters. Making sure that cyber is a priority and is elevated not only as its own domain, but cyber transcends air, land, sea, space, and the reality has implications and impact much broader from a national security and economic security perspective. So basically, we tried to take an attempt to really look back, see what's working right now, what's not, and what we need to be focusing on. So George, anything you want to add before we jump into the line of effort?
Just to tie into what you all were highlighting, momentum is key. And if you look at the last several years, there has been year on year, more and more momentum. And I think we have to sustain that. And that's the purpose of what we're doing here. But also we need that level of intensity to rise, because as much as we are gaining momentum and increased intensity, unfortunately, the threat continues to outpace our ability to match it. And so with any change administration, we need to sustain momentum and have continuity across the divides of time, because invariably when you have changes in leaders, you can have dips in focus. And so it's really incumbent upon us, and we're really driven to do this, to bring attention to those things that are working. Where do we need to pour more fuel? and where do we need new fuel on sustained systemic problems.
Well said. So why don't we jump into some of the lines of efforts themselves? And we came up with 8. If I'm being very honest to our viewers, we had hundreds of recommendations we had to boil down into dozens of recommendations. And I think the key here is these aren't just nouns on a document. They're meant to be implemented and acted upon with a sense of urgency. We did break it up to near-term priorities, mid-term priorities, and long-term priorities. But Mark, why don't we start with sort of line of effort number 1, which is unifying the regulatory landscape and what that means from a national security perspective.
This is an important one. It's actually, I think, one of the most recent one. I would say that it's of the 8 lines of effort we're going to talk about, it's the one that kind of emerged last. It came out of the the first inaugural national cybersecurity strategy. Chris Inglis, if he would tell you that he left one kind of hallmark initiative, and he left more than one, but the one I think that he's most coming back to, it's the idea that we need to take a more regulatory approach to the security of our critical infrastructure. But to do that in an effective way, you really need to first achieve regulatory harmonization. You can't continue to pile requirement on the private sector without first ensuring that you're not asking them to do this, the same thing in 5 different manners.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a pretty famous...
Which is happening to us.
It's happening, yeah. I mean, the most unimpressively was when the CERCIA law was passed, the National Cyber Incident Reporting Law, with its reporting requirements for companies. And then within, I think, 48 hours, the Security and Exchange Commission dropped proposed rulemaking that had different reporting requirements. Now, look, what bothered us at the commission was that the rest of that SEC rulemaking was our proposed changes to Sarbanes-Oxley and getting more senior leadership in there. So we generally had to support it, despite the fact that you saw this discordance with the recently passed CERCIA. And the executive branch knew what CERCIA was going to say. They were negotiating the exact differences in it. So for the executive branch to both negotiate the CERCIA numbers and then pass it and have it signed into law, and almost simultaneously issue an SEC rulemaking that was contrary to it, was kind of, I think, the point where Chris said, I have to comment on regulatory harmonization in the strategy up front. And so he did it. And so what we're doing is tapping right back into that and saying, look, there likely is more regulation needed in certain industries. But before you achieve that, you need to first show the American people how you get to harmonization. Senator Peters has passed a law, has drafted a provision that has passed his committee on regulatory harmonization. I think it was written very closely with Nick Lesherson, a senior official from the Office of National Cyber Director, who had testified at the Senate at the hearing for that. So I suspect, what we're doing here is saying, pick up that thread and run with it.
And George, there was also the need to synchronize some of the authorities.
Most definitely.
Title 10, Title 50, Title 18, 32, 40, and on the list goes. Anything you want to add?
Well, I think you made the point. There are many, many statutory frameworks that really need to create a continuum. And because it's so complex and there's so many, that creates ambiguity among individual agencies and departments that are actually trying to understand their lane, trying to understand how their lane connects to other lanes. And so part of the whole essence of this push on regulatory landscape and the harmonization thereof is really to get clarity and simplicity to the degree we can, because this is complicated. Cyber reaches all corners of everything. And so we need to create harmony and a continuum that is not just responsive to the threat, but also has the latitude to move with the threat as technology changes year on year.
And how they interact with their crucial partners in the private sector.
Most definitely.
And others.
Because look at the private sector, as we mentioned, they have an abundance of regulations coming down on them. They're spending more and more resources now on compliance, trying to just understand and untangle this web of compliance responsibilities. And that is bleeding some resources away from money they need to spend on better defenses.
Well said. And we double tapped a number of recommendations on operationalizing some of that collaboration. But before we jump to that, Line of effort number 2 is synergy in cyber protection, and that's strengthening national multi-stakeholder collaboration. You want to start?
I'll try first on that,
Yep.
only because, look, this is, if you were to grade the Cyberspace Solarium Commission and the Biden administration's implementation of and the Congress's implementation of many of the efforts, there's 2 areas I'd give you an A. One is on Department of Defense, moving the Department of Defense, and the, no surprise there, an annual NDAA. You get to tweak and tweak and tweak and tweak, and eventually get things right.
And you've been referred to as the NDAA whisperer.
Yeah,
so I've heard that for the first time yesterday, so loved it.
And the approach has also the approach is kind to Department of Defense, I just generally say. But it's outside of there. Like, the second area I'd give a strong one to was the reorganization of the government. And the 3 big things we were pushing was a Office of National Cyber Director, a strengthened and fully appropriated CISA, and an office in the State Department, to at the undersecretary level, its own bureau on cyber. All 3 of those has happened. We'll talk about the cyber one later, but what I would say here is that, it's getting just because you've established an Office of National Cyber Director, no cabinet agency's running on its first authorization, right? You tweak things along the way. As I said, the Secretary of Defense gets tweaked yearly, and if you look, there's actual tweaking to his job, his undersecretary's jobs, things like that, responsibilities, authorities given and removed. NCD is going to need another set of those. We need to take a fresh look at what's required there. And an incoming president— strengthen. And it is the job of the incoming president. She or he should look at that, determine what they want the NCD to do. We have some recommendations, and then move forward. And by the way, most importantly, talk to the former ones, the 2 confirmed ones, Chris Inglis and Harry Coker, but also the acting Kemba Walden. The 3 of those should be spoken to get their take on what's it. If I can mention one of the things.
Mention SRMAs, Mark.
Yeah. The other, and we're going to talk about SRMAs routine. You're going to hear the word SRMA through like 5 of these 8 lines of effort, because we did get them.
And spell it out. Sector risk
management agencies kind of replaced, at the time, the term of art was sector-specific agencies, but it was never ensconced in law. And so what happened was, if you're not in law, cabinet members don't have to do it, and some, like Department of Education, Department of Agriculture, EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, over decades were not doing their job. So not a partisan issue, on a bipartisan basis, failing to do the job. So you put it in law, now they're required to do the job. And also, it allows the appropriators to appropriate against the job. And that's important too, because to do the job, you need money. And we'll talk about that in a further sector.
George, you want to jump in on some
the only
of
thing
this?
I'd add there is
NCD,
just
maybe CISA, anything you are.
I mean, the biggest thing really hinges off the SRMAs and their reach into the corners of our society. And you look at how we're finding now with a lot of the threats from, say, Volt Typhoon and those types of things where critical infrastructure is at risk. And whether it's small companies or municipalities are not armed, fortified, or have talent to address these threats. And so having a helping hand from the associated SRMAs and then the big agencies and departments is really critical. And so collaboration really requires unity of effort and connectedness. And so that's part of what we need to drive.
And we had 8 recommendations in this section. Just one I want to double tap very briefly is supporting state, local, tribal, and territorial. Because at the end of the day, SLTT and the front lines, just like in the counterterrorism sets of issues, are often going to be state, local law enforcement, emergency managers, and the like.
Frank, I'm glad you bring that up, because we constantly say, and Dick Clark made this number up. He fortunately over time was proven to be true, but I know he made it up. 85% of our—
Didn't he say 88%?
Yeah, so he moved around, but we'll say 85% of our national critical infrastructure is not owned by the federal government.
Right.
But that 85% isn't owned by the private sector necessarily. A chunk of that are state and local utilities, tribal and territorial entities. And so they need the same kind of support. And honestly, in the who has 2 wood nickels to rub together, who has budget money, I would put state, local, tribal, and territorial at the bottom of the heap, because it's hard for them to change rates.
That's right.
Taxpayers tend not to appreciate
Tax stress.
it.
Look at the water
to raise
systems,
money.
all the threats there and their inability to really step up to those threats.
Look at the feds can't fill these jobs.
Right.
There are hundreds of thousands unfilled, and they're paying better than state and local. So, it's a huge issue, and we have some recommendations and creative ways to backfill some of that through volunteer and other sorts of attempts as well. But let's jump to line of effort number 3. And I'll take advantage of being closest to the mic right now and say, and this is looking at cost imposition, deterrence, and why it's a strategic imperative. And I think it's fair to say we are never going to firewall our way out of this problem.
Right.
The reality will continue to be, unless we can impose cost and consequence on bad cyber behavior, we shouldn't be surprised when we see lots of bad cyber behavior. We are beginning to lean forward, but I still think there's more to be done. So, George, I'll start with you
Sure.
on this one. Given your previous role,
Yeah.
I think you played a significant role in
Right.
all
Most
of
definitely.
this.
So, we were just talking about the challenge of defending in areas that are under-resourced and can't get the right skills in place. And just look at the pandemic, if you will, of ransomware and how that's hitting all corners of our country and our society, as well as a lot of the allied nations with whom we engage. And then you take the nation states that are actually pre-positioning to hold us at risk for a day of their choosing. You have both of those pressures coming down. We're trying to respond with, of course, better statutory frameworks, better technology, better coordination, and we need to do all those things. But we also have to put our eyes back at the source of the problem, right? And so you can't just sit there and defend. You actually have to put pressure and cost imposition in the other direction. And whether that's the nation states that are doing it or those who they harbor. And so we have made progress there, but I think we have to make a lot more progress. And I think we need to look at all aspects of levers of power and influence. Some of those are diplomatic, some are economic, but some are going to be more forceful. And also some are going to be more nuanced. We have a legal framework, both nationally and internationally, that we are trying to leverage to put imposition back on foreign actors. But a lot of those frameworks were built, I'll call them, they were built for human time. They're too slow and too antiquated for the sophistication of what we're dealing with.
Mark, anything you want to add? We had 3 recommendations in this section. One is actually coming up with enhancing operational capabilities through campaign plans and playbooks. The fact that we shouldn't act surprised when we know who the perpetrators are hitting us and kicking us in the derriere, and having those in place, as well as designating a process for state sponsors of cybercrime. That's something I have spent a lot of time working on, but I'd be curious if you want to weigh in on any of those. And quickly, because we got to
I just like that George called the military forceful, and I believe he called the IC nuanced. So I'll just leave it at that. I think we go to the next one.
Forceful and nuanced is good. So let's go to the next line of effort, and that is on resiliency. And this is looking at a proactive approach to risk reduction. And we had a number of recommendations in this particular line of effort, 5 of which I think we codified. So
this is important. So I said earlier that we did well in the commissioning and the Biden administration and Congress afterwards on DOD and on organizing the government. I'd say an area where we did not meet the mark was resilience. And I think, first of all, and we may recommend this very first, we need a system of prioritization. We can't boil the ocean. We can't protect Vicks dry cleaner at the same level as Dominion Power. In the end, we have to prioritize things. And, I think the term of art today would be systemically important entities.
Yep.
But whatever it is, you have to have that. And then you have to have a rule set around it. You can't just say in NSM, like the administration has said in National Security Memorandum 22, we need to have systemically important entities. We agreed wholeheartedly in our report here, and we said, and you need the next step,
right,
which is establish benefits and burdens associated with that. What's it mean to be a systemically important entity? What do you have to do? Third-party assessments, whatever it is, it says you've established a certain level of security.
You have to give, what do you get?
And then what do you get? And then, at some point, we're going to have to broach the issue of some liability protection for those companies when they're attacked by nation state, much like there would be protection if there was a cruise missile attack on their site, by a foreign power. If I could mention one other one, we talked about the need for sector-specific standards, and again, this gets back to sector risk management agencies, understanding doing proper assessments of their sector
Mhm.
and coming up with plans. And we recognize some of these sectors are too poor for regulation.
Right.
And those are the ones where we want to push things out. In water, we have something called the Water Risk and Resilience Organization that we're trying to get passed into law now. Those kind of things have to happen. And then at the higher end, things like financial services, nuclear power,
Exactly.
there's a regulatory kind of level. Most Americans understand that space, when it ever becomes a critical infrastructure, I know we'll talk about that in a minute. If you and I
no one
can
could escape, exactly.
Yeah, probably most Americans would support regulation, some level of regulation in space, because they don't want things falling on their house.
Exactly.
But in water and K through 12 education systems and food and ag, we're probably gonna have to start at a level below regulation if we're going to get to a successful solution.
George, anything you want to add on that?
No, I think he said it well.
I mean, at the end of the day, I think it's fair to say we need to lean forward and prevent all we can, but we're never going to be in a position where we can protect everything everywhere all the time from every perpetrator and every modality of attack. That we have to build in societal
And
resilience.
a lot of entities don't really understand the correlation of technologies that are at risk and the bottom line of their value chain in their companies
Well
or
said.
in their municipalities. And so really assessing risks and understanding their relative priority in your system that affects your bottom line, your continuity of operations, your ability to actually recover. We see many sophisticated companies that are knocked over by ransomware and they have an inability to get back on their feet. So there's something there that needs to be teased out.
And if you make the impact of an attack and minimize that and ameliorate that, that's also part of a broader deterrence effort.
That's right.
So let's go to line of effort number 5, and that's on cyber statecraft. So or do you want to jump back in?
I'll jump back in because this was a passion play for Representative Jim Langevin, our fellow commissioner. He had been pushing the Cyber Diplomacy Act along with Representative Mike McCall of Texas, who most importantly is chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. So the two of them pushed through and got the Senate on board with the Cyber Diplomacy Act. Senator King on the from our commission as well, pushing from the Senate side. This is critical. State Department needed to be better organized to deal with this. If they're going to lead the U.S.'s international effort to engage, which was absolutely insufficient for the challenge we were facing from China and Russia in international organizations, you needed a State Department leadership role. I think we were very fortunate to get Ambassador Nate Fick as our first leader of the cyber and digital diplomacy bureau at the State Department. And then the final thing I'd say on it is that we recommend a continued commitment to participation in international standard-setting organizations. The Trump administration got a big win in the World Intellectual Property Organization elections. The Biden administration got a big win in the International Telecommunications Union elections. We need to continue to get big wins in these to keep authoritarians out of the leadership positions.
Mark, and I'm going to let you jump in a second, George, but I'm
fine.
glad you brought that up. At the end of the day, and this is not to hyperventilate, but this is about democracies and autocracies. And this is not something we can afford to lose. And this isn't some squishy set of issues. This is very much in our national interest. But sorry.
Yeah, and I think, so many nations want to partner with us and get value from it. And all of the nations with whom we're engaging in the liberal democratic world are being hit by these same threats. And many of them are, of course, not as well situated as we are to push back. And so look at what's happened in probably about 40 nations now have come together on ransomware. I mean, those are examples. And as mentioned, Ambassador Fick has been really, along with those in the NSC, engaging internationally. And that really, not only is it relevant and brings value to the cause, but it also sends a message to the autocracies, because the one thing they can't do well is partner. They're very transactional and domineering, as we know. And so partnerships really matter.
And I might note, just last week, Ambassador Toby Feakin, Australia's first ambassador, weighed in very heavily on exactly those points, George. So thank you. George, why don't we start with you on the next line of effort, and that's building capacity and specifically strategies for a robust cybersecurity workforce.
Yeah.
I feel like I've seen this movie for many, 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 many years. What can we do to try to move the needle?
Yeah, I think we have to hit several fronts, of course. And one of the key things we'll bring out in this report is, and it really builds on what I know Harry Coker and ONCD have been pushing, is this whole, what's the future cyber workforce in America? And that doesn't just start after you graduate high school. It really starts in the K through 12, showing we have kids that are coming of age in a digital era. And so they are much more nimble than I ever was, of course, or any of us sitting
Certainly
here.
me, yeah.
And so exposing them to technology, exposing them to the inherent criticality of what cybersecurity means to our use of technology in every piece of our life. So that's just an exposure thing. And then you couple that with education and a way to actually make a difference. And whether that's in a very focused cybersecurity career path, or whether it's tangential but supporting. I think embedding that in the psyche of our next generation of children coming up through their various stages of education and maturation is just really key, because we have to understand that we're threatened day in and day out by criminals, of course, by nation states, but most of the breaches that happen are human factors, right?
Absolutely.
And it's because we love efficiency and expediency of our apps. And a lot of times security has been clunky. It gets in the way. It's too slow. And so that affects uptake. And so I think education is a big thing. And those kids can help make capabilities more seamlessly integrated so that you have more uptake.
Well said, Mark.
Let me jump.
Because
I'm
we had
a
a
big-
number. We had 6 recommendations in this.
And I'm a big workforce guy. It just, and the commission continued to work this with separate white papers and legislation. I'll tell you, first, I'm excited. We have great leaders inside government, career civil servants who've moved up. So a guy named Mark Gorak runs the Department of Defense one. He's fantastic. They've got, they're not solved, but they have a glide path to being right. And the right being I define as pretty close to how the IC runs cybersecurity
And
workforce.
upskilling veterans.
Upskilling
is
veterans,
key, right?
properly compensating people, onboarding them properly, training them properly. We have still have some provisions for the .gov to get there, because the .gov lags, but they've got people like Tony Benson at CISA running the K through 12 cybersecurity curriculum education. The Scholarship for Service, a program that I helped start almost 25 years ago, still running hard. A guy named Victor Prochowski at National Science Foundation running it. We have recommendations for funding there. And if a final thing I could mention, Representative Mark Green, chairman of the Homeland Committee, has just put forward the Pivot Act. And I think this is important.
It's a great bill.
Yeah.
It matches what Harry Coker, the National Cyber Director, has been saying, which is that this is more than 4-year education.
That's right.
This is about getting the community colleges, vocational schools involved. So you can have a school like Auburn with the Scholarship for Service program, NSA's CAE certification, but you go to these, sometimes you need, that produces great 4-year products. Sometimes what you need is a 2-year product or a 1-year product.
Most definitely.
Yep.
And this pays for that, pays their room and board while they do it, and then they owe government time, just like the Scholarship for Service, just like ROTC.
Yep.
So we're endorsing that as well. So from my perspective, workforce is an area we've been tackling. More work's needed, but you can actually see successes on the horizon if we go grab them.
Let me just double tap very quickly 2 other that were a little unique, and that's keeping in line with pushing some of the burden to those that have capability. We were looking at a virtual sort of CISO model for small, medium-sized businesses and obviously schools and the like. And then another one that I think is relatively unique is looking at how volunteer organizations, Estonia, Israel, number of countries have reserve capabilities, and we intentionally didn't go down the active reserve component alone here, but looked at other sorts of roles. So all things said and done, there's a lot of problem to go around, and there's not a whole lot of people to fix it. That said, I think we're making some progress. Let's go to the next line of effort, and that's Securing the Future. Nice title, but it's looking at safeguarding critical and emerging technologies. And I think we often take for granted our leadership and, dare I say, superiority in some of these areas, but we can no longer take that for granted.
That's right.
At all. You want to start, George, or Mark, or either?
I'm happy to start. I mean, technology is kind of the breadbasket of the United States. It's
Always
been
has
our
been.
signature in the world, and it's really been the outcome that shows the power of what we represent. as a democracy. And so we need to understand that. We need to protect it. But we also need to understand it all is not just in the United States. We are totally globally interconnected. And if you just look at our software supply chain, most of the software that's used today is built globally, unbeknownst to all of us that use it. There are perils there that we need to grapple with. And so understanding, especially as we bring manufacturing home to the United States, which we are doing and must do more rapidly, that brings power, leverage for our economy, for our industrial base, but it also brings peril if we aren't mindful. And so emerging technologies have to be understood and protected. We also have to understand that we are in a race. China is very open and out there with respect to its strategies to dominate many technologies that the U.S. has dominated for many years. That's a signal to us. And we know that if they can't do it by themselves, they have a proclivity to come and take our technology. And so that can't be an easy street.
No
So,
joke.
The other one I think is the supply chain management. We had just
Key.
we had just finished for the China Select Committee a look at deep dives on weapon systems, and you kind of think, well, the Chinese part might be in like the 8th or 9th level of the supply chain. Nope. And the vast majority of these illuminations, the Chinese part showed up in the 2nd or 3rd level down.
Right.
There's a Chinese company domiciled in the United States that just is a pass-through to microelectronics production in China. Now, look, 20 years ago when this was set up, that probably seemed harmless. As we sit here today, the idea that someone could install physical or cyber malware into a supply part going into a weapon system is highly likely. And certainly the idea that someone would deny you spare part, these constituent parts in a crisis when you're trying to build up your munition supplies is 100% likely. So hitting that supply chain, we have 2 recommendations there on that that I think need to be strongly attacked. And this is one area where the Department of Defense probably is not yet where it needs to be.
And while it may not be sexy, it's really important. Just having lists that are unified in terms of what technologies, emerging technologies I can and cannot buy, making it a little easier for our critical infrastructure owner operators who have to sometimes go through 3 different lists, and next thing you know, ET's calling home.
Yeah. And some prioritization. We need to better prioritize things.
So I think we have a handful of recommendations. We're in the red zone now, so let's go to you on this one, Mark. Last line of effort is a set of issues you were a big champion on in terms of continuity of the economy, but I think it's also more broadly, I don't think we'll find anyone who says cyber doesn't matter, but policy without resources is rhetoric. So where are the dollars? So
I'm glad you
talk
said
dollars and cents.
I'm glad that way I didn't have to say, as Frank Cilluffo says. Okay, first we'll go with resources. And I'll tell you, our resources, there's a mismatch between the rhetoric of I do this, I support this, and the actual budget. Now, some federal agencies, some sector risk management agencies are all right. Department of Energy, I'd say, is all right. The financial regulators are all right. The vast majority of the rest are not all right. So a place like Department of Agriculture, with and Department of Education with $250,000 to $500,000 budgets for sector risk management agencies, we all professionals know that's 1 or 2 full-time equivalents.
Yeah.
One person cannot support 8,000 farms. One person cannot support 11,000 unified school districts. They're basically doing website maintenance at that point. They need to be improved. The other big budget one was NIST. We assessed it as 40% underfunded in 2021. Since then, it's got about a 15% bump. You say, well, you're getting there, except it's gotten all this additional tasking.
Exactly.
Every executive order says, NIST do this, NIST do that. There's no money in the executive order. So if the budget doesn't go up, you're not there. So NIST is no longer 40% undermanned. It's probably underfunded. It's 60%. And then finally, you mentioned continuity of the economy. If Tom Fanning were here, he would have mentioned it first.
He did in a previous
there you
episode,
go.
yes.
So what I would say is, we're at that point where the Department of Homeland Security needs to take leadership on this. The White House needs to acknowledge the importance of it and not say it's covered by our existing decision-making. And what really is required is an increased role for the private sector in the decision-making. We are at a point where they own or operate 85, as we said, 85% of the national critical infrastructure along with the state and local governments. but they're nowhere to be found in the decision making on how to move forward in a crisis.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of prioritization, they're going to be critical to doing what the president wants, and you're going to need them more involved.
And Mark, if you can give 2 seconds on the framing of continuity of the economy. We're all familiar with continuity of the government, continuity of operations, and all the old national security implications, but this has much bigger
yes, this has to do with the recovery of your major critical infrastructures following a significant cyber attack or significant disaster, probably coupled with a cyber attack. And what's important here is that you get back your national security for military mobility, your rail, train, and rail, aviation, and port systems, but also you get back your economic productivity. That's one of our strongest tools in dealing with an adversary. And then, of course, your public health and safety. You need to keep the American people alive, during these events.
And fair to say, national security and economic security are inextricably interwoven today. George, anything you want to add on this?
No.
Well, without further ado, then that is a wrap. Please do take a few minutes to read the report, and let me thank both of our civil servants, rock stars, and good friends, Mark Montgomery and George Barnes, for joining us today. So,
thank you, Frank.
Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. Thanks.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Cyber Focus. If you liked what you heard, please consider subscribing. Your ratings and reviews help us reach more listeners. Drop us a line if you have any ideas in terms of topics, themes, or individuals you'd like for us to host. Until next time, stay safe, stay informed, and stay curious.